Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional leagues, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ryan Basulto. Thank you again for listening to another episode of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe us on Twitter, YouTube, you know the rest. Julio has been all over the news, and I hate to keep just talking about him because I know you're saying, oh, this is already the second straight episode. So I try to switch it up a bit. Julio Jones also said again this week on the Undisputed Show, Shannon Sharpe called him, and some people are wondering if Julio Jones knew he was on speakerphone or not, on live television to be exact. But Julio Jones said on live television on the Undisputed Show that he is going to get up out of there on, and he's talking about the Seattle Seahawks, the Atlanta Falcons, wrong bird, and he would not go to the Cowboys because he wants to win. So that narrows down two teams that Julio Jones isn't going to be on next year. I remember last time on the show we talked about the greatness of Julio Jones. We talked about all the teams that would want Julio Jones. Teams are like the Ravens. The Ravens would look good with them. The Niners would be another good team with Julio Jones. The Chargers, I would say, would be the best option. But Julio Jones is one of the best receivers of all time. I think he's top 5. And I was just talking to someone the other day about Julio Jones, and he does not think Julio Jones is top 5. He doesn't think he's better than Larry Fitzgerald. He doesn't think he's better than Terrell Owens. And I think Julio Jones is a better just talent, and everything about Julio Jones is the perfect receiver. 6'2", 220, aggressive, fast, faster than your corners, faster than your safeties, stronger than your corners and stronger than your safeties. Julio Jones is a dime a dozen of receivers. But let's not forget Matt Ryan, who has over 30,000 career passing yards. Matt Ryan is one of the best quarterbacks of all time. I'm not saying, okay, he's top 10, top 20, but I'm saying if you did a top 50, top 30 quarterbacks all time, Matt Ryan is up there. So that helped propel Julio Jones to become a great receiver, to catch 1,800 yards in a season. So I wanted to do an all-time rankings of Julio Jones, but this isn't an NFL football show or anything. This is the Fantasy Football Podcast. So we're going to see how good or how high you should get Julio Jones in next year's fantasy draft. I did a list, top 30 receivers in the league, so we're going to get in depth. It's going to be into separate tiers. The first tier we're going to go over is the bottom tier, and this isn't the bottom tier, but this is where you would get receivers probably 5th, 6th, 7th round, and then it's just going to go upwards to being the best receivers that you should get in the draft. I have them in different tiers. Let's give some honorable mentions to Chase Claypool. Chase Claypool didn't make my list. I know he had a good season, catching over 900 yards in his rookie year. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, Curtis Samuel had another good go-go gadget year, as he was a good gadget player. He would run the ball. He would catch the ball. Now he's on the football team. Different look, different eyes. Devontae Parker wasn't too healthy last year. Not enough to make my list. And Jarvis Landry, Cleveland Brown. He is also another one who didn't make the list. Let's get into this, though. Let's go into the third tier of wide receiver 3 in fantasy football. Let's start off with number 30, Jalen Waddle. Yes, you haven't seen that much production from him coming in the NFL because this is his first year. He's going to be in the Miami Dolphins. He has a good position to go at because he's also been on the field with less snaps and less experience when it comes to football. So he has a lot more talent, especially for him to be a top 6 pick. That shows you the type of talent he has. Tua Tagovailoa was his quarterback in college, dating back to last year. Tua, not last year, but the year before that. Jalen Waddle knows the Alabama system. Tua and him have that chemistry. We love it together. Sorry, I wanted to say the creamistry because that's a type of ice cream place, and I'm like, oh, okay, I want some creamistry. But no, the chemistry between Tua, and it's just so hot outside. It's hot in Cali right now. I'm pretty sure it's hot everywhere, but it is hot. So an ice cream sounds pretty good. The chemistry, the creamistry that melts within together Tua and Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle had over 600 yards last year. Wasn't a crazy, outstanding guy, but he has crazy big playability. And if you are going to give me a big playability, and I know he's smaller than Devontae Smith, but he does weigh, not shorter than Devontae Smith, but he does weigh more. He's a little heavier than Devontae Smith. He's a great speedster. He could break loose. The Miami Dolphins offense says that they're going to have a whole new look going into next year. So I believe that Jalen Waddle is going to help lead that charge. Tua and him already have the connection, so there's nothing to really say, oh, well, maybe he won't work out with the new quarterback. No, he should work out. Jalen Waddle in that wide receiver 3 tier, barely making the wide receiver 3 tier. Let's go on to the next one. Chris Godwin. Christopher Smith Jr. Godwin. I'm just giving him a bunch of nicknames. No, I'm kidding. He's Chris Godwin, receiver from the Tampa Bay Bucks. 65 catches, 840 yards, and 7 touchdowns last year to be one of the top fantasy offenses with the Bucks. When Chris Godwin was in the game, he was good. He dropped 13, 17, 23, 15, a lot of great fantasy games. He had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 fantasy games where he went double-digit points. And this is all according to, PPR format. Forgot to say that. PPR format, points per reception, the best type of league you could do. But yes, Chris Godwin, he's not going to be the number 1 option. And I think with Antonio Brown coming back, he's not even going to be the number 2 option. They're going to try to make him the number 2 option. But just know they still have Gronk, Leonard Fournette, everyone else in between. So Mike Evans is going to be the number 1 on that team. Chris Godwin is the lowest ranked out of all the Buccaneers receivers. Yes, I already spoiled it. But I do like his promise because in games against the Saints, the Falcons, divisional games, 2 games against the Falcons to be exact, he scored touchdowns scored 4 touchdowns in those 3 division games. Chris Godwin's going to be playing the same people next year. Last year, he missed a total of 5 games. You're hoping for that, not for that again next year. Chris Godwin, a good look in that barely making the wide receiver 3 tier. Let's move on to the next one. Antonio Brown. Yes, Antonio Brown signed a 1-year, $6 million deal again with the Tampa Bay Bucks with Mike Evans on one side, Chris Godwin in the middle. Antonio Brown is an unfair disadvantage at the slot receiver. He had 45 catches for 483 yards and 4 touchdowns. He didn't start till week 9. After that, he only had 2 single-digit fantasy performances. One was terrible against the Chiefs. Yes, but I bet you that wasn't the game plan, and that's the problem. Even though he gave you games of 36, 13, 20, 13, and 13 against divisional rivals and some bad defenses, but still, he gave you that 3 against the Chiefs. You know why? Because they had to steer away the game plan. They had to go probably to Mike Evans because Tyrann Mathieu is probably guarding Antonio Brown in the slot because Tyrann Mathieu is a slot corner who lines up over usually slot receivers because as a safety, that's what you usually do. So Tyrann Mathieu being a better defender, then probably double bracketing Antonio Brown. All that stuff is going to lead to less touches for Antonio Brown, less touches for Chris Godwin. If you had to choose between the two, I like Antonio Brown over Chris Godwin. Let's move on to number 27. Will Fuller, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, who's probably going to be the best receiver on the Miami Dolphins. Sorry, Devontae Parker did not make the list. Yes, he was suspended. He got hurt and then suspended last year, but his 2020 season started off hot. 879 yards, 8 touchdowns, 53 catches. We know Will Fuller does. When he plays, he's an absolute monster, but mind you, a lot of this has been, or all of last year, showed that it was all with Deshaun Watson, the number one passer in all of the NFL. So can Tua do the same type of things that Deshaun Watson did? Maybe, but I feel like William Fuller, I'm sorry, I saw William Fuller because that's his real name. William Fuller, the fifth, to be exact, if you want his government name, he is going to have a outstanding year. Brian Flores just loves to open up that playbook. He will do end arounds with Myles Gaskin throwing touchdowns. He is not afraid. William Fuller the fifth is someone that I could trust in the wide receiver 3, but you can't make him wide receiver 2. His wide receiver 2 upside, because he scored all of that within the first couple weeks, he would have easily finished with 1,000 yards, maybe even 1,200 yards at the way and the pace he was going, over 10 touchdowns, which would have been one of the best receivers in the NFL. 1,200 yards, not 12,000. Next year, I think he's going to get around 73 catches, 1,000-something yards, and about 7 touchdowns, because Tua's not as much of a red zone guy as Deshaun Watson. Temper your expectations because Will Fuller gets hurt, suspended, and that's never a good luck. The 26th ranked receiver, and also in the wide receiver 3 candidates, is Brandon Ayuk. Last year he had 60 catches, 748 yards, and 5 touchdowns in his rookie year. With inconsistent quarterback play, Brandon Ayuk was one of the better bright spots of this 49ers offense. Had standout games against the Giants where he scored 21 fantasy points. You like it a lot because he had 5 catches for 70 yards. And he also rushed a touchdown. What about against the Patriots and that crazy Stephon Gilmore and that crazy secondary? Yeah, he had 6 catches, 115 yards in New England. Then he goes off against the Saints and Marshawn Lattimore, 20 fantasy points off 7 catches, 75 yards, and 1 touchdown. And then he just knocks out 5 straight 20-point performances spanning from Week 8 up to Week 15. Brandon Ayuk is a stud. He's the best receiver on the Niners going into next year if they don't get Julio Jones. I like Brandon Ayuk a lot because last year was his rookie year. He didn't have consistent quarterback play without Jimmy G. Now that it looks like Jimmy G is going to come back, Brandon Ayuk's going to get more touches, more looks, and more fantasy points. You could expect a lot of the 10 catches for 119 yards or 5 catches for 95 yards. You can't keep this guy out of the end zone. Last year, he got 4 touchdowns spanning from Week 6 all the way to Week 15 in 9 weeks. This is only the beginning for him. This guy also caught over 7 receptions in 6 games. Stud. We like Brandon Ayuk going into next year. Let's go on to the next guy who is kind of low, but still, Kenny Golladay. He did not play much last year. 20 catches for 338 yards. He only played Week 3, Week 4, Week 6, and Week 7. Week 5 was a bye week. But in all those weeks, he scored double-digit fantasy points, and he didn't score anything less than 14 fantasy points, which was a 4-catch, 105-yard effort against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Kenny Golladay, don't forget, I know Daniel Jones, we can't trust him. That's why he's a wide receiver 3. If Kenny Golladay was on a normal team, he would be a wide receiver 1/wide receiver 2. Easily. Kenny Golladay has the build. He's tall enough. He could reach at the highest point of catching a ball. Great ball skills, great catching ability, long playability. Kenny Golladay is going to be a stud on the Giants offense. But he didn't play a lot last year. His inconsistent play, but that was the only year that he's ever done that. Every other year he's played all the games. His inconsistent play, along with being on the Lions, along with Daniel Jones now, is the only reason why he's in the wide receiver 3 candidate. Let's move on to the next one, who I would say draft higher than him, Tyler Lockett, who finished as the 8th ranked receiver. It almost is fool's gold because a lot of those games, a lot of those yards and fantasy points come from 1 or 2 games. He did have 100 catches, 1,000 yards, and 10 touchdowns last year, totaling 260 fantasy points. But let's more notably talk about his Week 7 game where he scored 53 fantasy points on me in particular. I was so sad because DK went off that game, but Tyler Lockett had a game. 3 touchdowns, 200 yards, 15 points. Also 9 catches, 100 yards, 3 touchdowns for 37. Those 2 games took up a lot of his fantasy points, and the Week 17 game where some people aren't even playing in Week 17, like I, and he scored 33 fantasy points. Tyler Lockett gives you great boom games. Boom, 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 boom. 37, 19, 17, 53, 21, 33. But then he gives you these other games. Prime time game against the Eagles. Prime time game against, not prime time, but it's just prime time in the sense that this guy should go off. It's prime. It's a great matchup. He goes against the Vikings. Guess what? He only scores 8 fantasy points. You know why? Because DK scored 30 fantasy points because they were going to DK that game. They kind of switch off sometimes. Then when he goes against the Philadelphia Eagles, terrible secondary, only 5 fantasy points. He goes against the Washington football team and the Rams, decent fantasy team. I mean, great fantasy defenses, but only comes away with 7. Dolphins only gets 5. He's a boomer bust, and that's why he's a wide receiver 3. Otherwise, he would be higher because, like I said, over 100 catches, 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns. That's all you can ask for from a receiver. But he will give you 53 to put you in the fantasy championship and then drop 7 in the fantasy championship and lose it for you. That's not what we're here for. We are here to win the fantasy championship going into next year. Let's move on to the next guy on my list, Devontae Smith. Yes, he was a rookie, but he did catch over 20 touchdowns last year and over 1,800 yards receiving. Heisman winning receiver, which is not easy to do, especially when you're only 175 pounds. He's a flyer. He's the number 1 option on the Jalen Hurts-led offense. I like Devontae Smith heavy on that Eagles offense. I like him over Tyler Lockett because I feel like he's going to get more love as the number 1 receiver on that team. They know they failed with Jalen Reagor. Jalen Hurts also was his quarterback in college, so that's another thing that could help. Once again, we got the chemistry over here, we got the big playability, and we got the accolades. So Devontae Smith, have him over Tyler Lockett. Almost had him over this guy, but I can't do it. Adam Thielen, the 10th ranked receiver last year in fantasy, had 74 catches, 925 yards, and 14 touchdowns. That 14 touchdowns is probably going to regress as the next year starts because there's no way you could keep up that rate, especially with newfound gold Justin Jefferson. Yes, he does give you great games of 31, 25, 29 against terrible defenses, mind you, but still gave you 4 games where he scored 2 touchdowns, and he scored touchdowns in all but 5 games. You can't not hate Adam Thielen, but Adam Thielen is still wide receiver 3 just because he'll get hurt. He missed a game, and then in the fantasy playoffs, if you started week 14 like everyone normally did, he gave you 6, 9, 23, 9 against the Bears and the Lions. Those are division rivals, and if he's not doing that, then you know Justin Jefferson's ready to take over, and it's his time. So Adam Thielen's still someone you could get, but I would get him in the 4th or 5th round. If you get him in the 5th round, it's a steal. It's a big steal. Next one, we're going with Robert Woods to end this wide receiver 3 ranking. Let me know what you think at GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on Twitter. DM me. Let me know if you think Devontae Smith's too high. Kenny Galladay. Is Brandon Ayuk not high enough? Is Chris Godwin not high enough? But Robert Woods, the 14th ranked receiver last year, 90 catches, 936 yards, 6 touchdowns. We like him better with Matt Stafford next year. He's going to go for over 1,000 yards. They also got rid of Josh Reynolds. More touches for Robert Woods. He's the most consistent guy on this team. In the first 6 weeks, the lowest he scored was 9 and the highest score was 21. That's crazy consistency. He only gave you single-digit fantasy points 4 to 5 times throughout the whole year out of the 16 weeks. So you know that he's at least going to give you a good amount. One game he gave you 5, but after that, the lowest he's pretty much just giving you is 8 fantasy points. That's why you don't know if you could trust him fully or not. There's a lot of options. The Rams want to be a run-heavy offense. I already talked about it in my fantasy football previews. If you haven't heard of them, Go check them out at GSMC Fantasy Football. I go over previews about every single team. Today's previews, I'm going to go over the Seahawks, and I'm going to go over the Rams. Also, I've went over the AFC East. I went over the NFC East. I went over the AFC North. Now it's time to do the NFC West. When we come back, I'm going to do all my wide receiver 2s. This is the second tier, the wide receiver 2 list. And we'll see, is Julio Jones here or is he in the first tier when we come back?
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
We are back here at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the GSMC Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I meant the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. With all your fantasy wants and needs, and we are here to make you a champion. Do you realize that you're a champion? Champion. You heard that song? Kanye West, Champion? Great song. Before I got a little weird, but it's okay. We're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about fantasy football. And I have been breaking down the tiers from wide receiver 3 was my last tier, where I said the likes of Brandon Ayuk, Antonio Brown, Robert Woods, Devontae Smith. These guys are great, but they have some flaws in their system, and I don't know if they're going to be the number 1 receivers going into next year. Very unlikely, but you never know. Fantasy football shows no one mercy, ever. And Julio Jones is one of the best receivers of all time. And since all this world news is swirling around about Julio Jones, is he going to stay? Well, he's not going to stay. He already said it. He said, I'm out of there. I'm out of the Falcons. I'm not going to the Cowboys because I want to win. So he's going to go to a contending team. Ravens, Chargers, Niners. I don't know who he's going to go to. He wants to go to the Patriots. All this is great news, but we have to see, where does Julio Jones fit in kind of like 30 receivers. If I were to name 30 receivers, which I am now, we'll see where Julio Jones fits going into fantasy football, going into next year. It would have been not the smartest idea. Well, it would have just been, it had to be a bonus if I was going to say top 10 fantasy receivers of all time and see if Julio Jones would crack that list. But since you want to know about the now, we are here about the presents. We want to know what is going to happen into next year's fantasy football. And I'm talking to you. I feel like I'm just doing a wrestling promo right now, like WWE. I'm talking to you. When I help you out with fantasy football, by the end of it, you will become the biggest champion of champions of all champions. That's a triple crown, baby. That's how we do it. Take it to the bank. Woo! So anyways, yes, fantasy football, we are going on to the second tier of wide receivers, kind of like a 20 through 10 or 20 through 11 fantasy football receivers. I'm going to name another 10 that I feel you should get probably around the third or fourth round because of their big playability, potential, team. You can name it. These receivers can do it. At the end of the show, I'm going to give my NFL preview on some of the NFC West teams, the Seahawks and the Rams in particular. Let's start off with my number. Well, doesn't matter. Going into wide receiver 2, tier 2. We're starting at 20. T. Higgins. T. Higgins, I like going into next year because last year he got a lot of volume when Joe Burrow was there. Joe Burrow was a top 10 fantasy quarterback when he was playing. 67 catches for 908 yards and 6 touchdowns. He had to deal with the likes of Ryan Finley and Brandon Allen and a bunch of terrible quarterbacks on that Cincinnati Bengals roster throughout the year. But yet this guy still scored 21 fantasy points, 9, 10, 15, 22 when Joe Burrow was there. Yes, he had a shaky start with the first game. He only dropped 6 points, the second game against 6 points against the Cleveland Browns. But from weeks 3 to 10, he scored double-digit fantasy points. Lowest he scored was 10. He dropped 21 or over 20 twice. T. Higgins going into next year, we love him. He's a great slot option. He's a great safety blanket for Joe Burrow. 67 catches with terrible quarterback play is pretty good. Next year, get ready to see a boost. He was a rookie last year, and Jamar Chase is also going to open up the field a lot. Jamar Chase, he's an animal. He's going to be a beast next year, I promise you. But T. Higgins, someone else on that Bengals roster who is going to do a lot of damage. He's definitely a wide receiver 2/wide receiver 3. I like him right there in the wide receiver 2 just because of the volume he gets. He's not getting 8 to 12 catches a game, but he does get 6 to 8 targets a game and usually a red zone option and big play guy. I'd like to see him going into next year. Last year he only scored 6 touchdowns. He could score more touchdowns than that. That was the floor. He hasn't hit his ceiling yet. T. Higgins going into next year. I love it. Another receiver I love, Deontay Johnson, helped me win a fantasy championship. I see him getting around 90-something catches for 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. He's not a big touchdown guy. He's a big reception guy. 88 catches for 923 yards and 7 touchdowns as the 21 ranked fantasy football receiver according to PPR formats. Deontay Johnson, when he wasn't injured, if he didn't get injured in a game, he only scored single digits twice. So he scored 9 in one and 8 in the other, which isn't bad. Because everything else is 23, 29 against the Titans, 23 against the Bengals, decent cornerbacks. And remember, he's going to be playing these teams all the time. These are his division rivals, and he can still cook them. The Browns, he scored 12. The Colts, one of the better defenses in the NFL, he scored 21 fantasy points, 8 catches, 74 yards, and a touchdown, and helped me win a fantasy championship, baby. Boom! Yes, I love it. You gotta love it. We love it. Cincinnati Bengals, once again, he dropped 19 fantasy points. This guy's a stud. Didn't drop anything lower than 19 against the Bengals going into next year. He plays them twice again this upcoming year. Bring it up. And then what are they going to have to guard? Juju Smith, Chase Claypool. Both those guys are not on my fantasy list, by the way. But both of those guys are definitely going to open up the field for him, including Najee Harris. Look for Deontay Johnson to be an absolute steal. Steal, I say, in next year's draft. Someone I like coming on to a bounce back year. He didn't have many catches or touchdowns, and that production should get better. He had 66 catches, 1,193 yards, and 4 touchdowns. I'm talking about number 12, DJ Moore on the Carolina Panthers. A new sheriff's in town. They got Sam Darnold. They revamped that defense, so hopefully they get the ball more. He's going against the Bucks and the Saints, and that is why I do not want to put him too high. But he's right there in the Deontay Johnson range. I would rank them almost pretty much similarly. That's why I was like, this is more about tiers. But I'm saying in order from, I would say, I would draft them lowest. I'm going lowest to highest. So, for example, if I said, T. Higgins is in my wide receiver 2 range, and then I got Deontay Johnson who was higher than him, I would say Deontay Johnson. If it comes between Deontay Johnson and T. Higgins when you see your draft them. Because even though these are rankings, still, everyone's draft is not the same. You're going to deal with people who are going to draft Will Fuller in the second round or Devontae Smith. And then at that point, they value them like that. It's like art, like actual art. It may not be worth $20,000, but to someone it's worth $20,000. And that's how art works. And that's your little art lesson for Fantasy Football 101. Bing. All right, the 24th ranked receiver last year still had 1,193 yards, but Teddy Bridgewater played awful last year. One of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, bottom 15. So he only had 66 catches. DJ Moore shows you glimpses of hope because he scored double-digit fantasy points in 9 of his 16 games. He also scored over 20 fantasy points in 3 of those games, scoring 19 in 3 of the other games. So basically scored fantasy 20 points in 6 games. He was 1 point off in 3 games, but still 20 points in 6 games. He catches. He's a deep ball guy. He's a big playability guy, and Sam Darnold's going to open that up. Also, remember, Christian McCaffrey wasn't there. Christian McCaffrey is a great running back, a great pass-catching running back. Your linebackers and safeties have to be glued to the backfields. DJ Moore is going to slip behind them. They have Robbie Anderson, who they just said, oh, hey, now we like him. We like what he could prove. They also added a rookie receiver, so I like the Panthers receiving core in general. DJ Moore is the best out of those options. Robbie Anderson, sorry, Robbie, you did not make the list. DJ Moore, I would draft over Deontay Johnson. But I would say they're interchangeable because Deontay Johnson has showed you better production last year. DJ Moore just has more potential. And he has, once again, hit the floor guy. He hasn't even hit his ceiling. Number 17. Oh, man. Number 17. Julio Jones. Yes. Julio Jones, the man of the hour. The reason I made this list. Julio Jones is ranked at 17. Last year was the least amount of games he played last year in a season at 9. Well, this is the least he's played since like 2013. But he showed you glimpses of greatness. He dropped 33 fantasy points against the Vikings, 8 catches, 137 yards, 2 touchdowns. Seattle Seahawks also, he got 9 catches for 157 yards and 24 fantasy points. But Julio Jones, we don't know what team he's going to. And everyone else in front of him, I am comfortable with drafting in front of Julio Jones, and I can say that with exact confidence. That is why Julio Jones is ranked at 17th. I don't know what team he's going to go to. If he goes to the Patriots, that might drop a little bit because Cam can't throw too well. Didn't even throw 10 touchdowns last year. I don't know what's going to happen. What if he goes to the Ravens? Lamar Jackson can't even throw as much. He tries to throw, but he can't throw as great. He's not as accurate on his passes. Barely a 60% completion percentage. And then the Niners, what if they get terrible quarterback play because Trey Lance is a rookie and Jimmy G? We need him on the Chargers. We don't know where he's going. Julio's a question mark. He is my number 17th receiver going into next year until I say otherwise. Wow, that was really anticlimactic, right? Julio at 17? Well, you know why he's at 17? Pay attention, because every single person I'm going to say after this is going to do better in fantasy football than Julio Jones as of right now. Number 16, Jamar Chase. Yes, I said it. The rookie. The rookie from Cincinnati. Oh, did he put 2 Cincinnati Bengals on? Yes, I put 2 Cincinnati Bengals because Joe Burrow's got the swagger like that. He's a top 10 quarterback during his rookie year, even without one of the most stellar lines in the NFL. He puts it all out on the field. He has Joe Mixon in the backfield, who's an RB1, a standout running back out of Oklahoma. He has Tyler Boyd, T. Higgins, and Jamar Chase. But Jamar Chase is going to be his favorite just because they went to college together, over 1,700 yards, 20 touchdowns in his junior season at LSU. He decided to opt out of last year, so he might need to get back into football shape. But after the first couple of weeks, get ready. Jamar Chase is going to keep steamrolling. And don't say I didn't warn you. Do not say I didn't warn you. Jamar Chase has exactly what it takes to be the next Julio Jones. And he has the best connection with his quarterback. Some of these guys like Devontae Smith, yes, they played a little bit with Jalen Hurts. Yes, Jalen Waddle played a little bit with Tua Tagovailoa. But they did not get as much reps and as much action together as Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow. Expect them to be the best duo in fantasy going forward in dynasty leagues and in next year. They should be one of the better ones. Number 15, Julio's division rival. I'm just dissing Julio left and right, aren't I? Mike Evans, Mr. 6 years in a row, 5 years in a row, I forgot which one it is, that he has caught over 1,000 yards, 70 catches, 1,006 yards, and 13 touchdowns. I would normally say the 13 touchdowns is going to just get worse as the season progresses or like as his career progresses. But this guy's an absolute machine. He has a couple games where he only has 1 catch. Only 2 games where he has 1 catch, actually. But that still is a couple. But one of them, he still scored 500 away to get that 1 catch as a touchdown. He had a touchdown in all but 6 games. So 10 games he had a touchdown in. You got to trust him, especially going into next year. He had 40 fantasy points in one game. He had a stint from week 8 to week 12 where he dropped 16, 10, 19, 15, 20 fantasy points. Yes, he gave you terrible games of 2 and 5 against the Raiders and the Packers, but that's in the beginning of the season. If anything, it dropped you lower on the waiver wire, helped you out. Then he helped you throughout the playoffs. Minnesota, not too much with the 8, but 17 and 40 in the fantasy championship. Mike Evans is going to continue to be Tom Brady's guy. He was the 11th ranked receiver last year. I still expect over 70 catches because he's not a possession guy. He's a touchdown guy, and he's a vulture. Tom Brady is a guy who likes to go to someone who's going to make him look good. Mike Evans always makes him look good. He doesn't go to receivers that drop the ball. Sometimes Chris Godwin does. Antonio Brown's kind of a diva. Mike Evans, gotta like him, longtime buck. Animal. Next year expect 70-something yards, 1,100 yards, 70-something catches, 1,100 yards, and around the same 10 touchdowns. You know who I like more than Mike Evans, though? CeeDee Lamb. Slot receiver out of the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb had 74 catches, 935 yards, and 5 touchdowns, totaling 206 fantasy points. He was the 22nd ranked receiver. Last year, I feel like he's going to be a top 15 receiver just because these other guys are amazing in front of him. Yes, is CeeDee Lamb better than Julio? Yes, he is. When Dak Prescott was there in PPR format, CeeDee Lamb had 10, 16, 11, 24, and 20 fantasy points. He dropped nothing lower than 10 fantasy points when Dak was there. When Dak wasn't there, you got numbers of 13, 0, 7, 15, 16, 7, 10, 7. Picked it up towards the end with 19 and 22 to help you win your fantasy championship if you made it that far. With CeeDee Lamb, expect a lot more from CeeDee Lamb next year because Dak Prescott's back. You're not going to get terrible play from Andy Dalton or Ben DiNucci or whoever they throw back there because Dak Prescott needed to get paid, and now he's paid, and now he's ready. Next year, you can definitely expect over 1,000 yards, over 6, 7 touchdowns, 8 touchdowns probably, and 80 catches plus for CeeDee Lamb. He's the best. He's one of the best receivers on that Cowboys offense. Definitely the second best option behind Zeke. But CeeDee Lamb with Dak Prescott is going to be an absolute stud next year. Wide receiver 2 written all over it. I would definitely get CeeDee Lamb over Mike Evans just because CeeDee Lamb isn't a wide receiver trio, but they like to milk it more to CeeDee Lamb. He's more of a possession guy, and he will still find the end zone because he is that good. They wouldn't give him 88 if he wasn't good. But the next one is his NFC East rival, Terry McLaurin. I would draft Terry McLaurin over CeeDee Lamb because of the production he's given us over the past couple years. He's going to get Ryan Fitzpatrick, who's a gunslinger. He had 87 catches for 1,118 yards and 4 touchdowns, making him the 19th ranked receiver in fantasy last year. He couldn't have been higher because Dwayne Haskins, Alex Smith didn't have a consistent quarterback. Now he's going to have Ryan Fitzpatrick. When he does have a consistent quarterback play, he's dropping 25, 12, 21. He only got single-digit fantasy points 3 games, and only single-digit fantasy points 1 game from weeks 1 through 12. That production is great. You knew towards the end of the year they were just going to focus on Antonio Gibson a little more. Antonio Gibson's going to take some of the touches from Terry, but Scary Terry going into next year is a big, big must. He is definitely going to be a top 15 receiver, especially with Ryan Fitzpatrick. I would say that, but CeeDee Lamb and Terry McLaurin in the same. I wouldn't be mad at you if you draft one over the other, but they're right next to each other, and I would draft them both over Mike Evans due to Tom Brady wants to just win, so they're going to run the ball some games. CeeDee Lamb is just going to have to always be out there and always catch balls from Dak Prescott. He's not a guy you pull from the game either. He's a young guy. Let him rock. He's going to be in there about 90% of the offensive snaps. CeeDee Lamb, trust him a lot going into next year. Terry McLaurin as well, who I have it, the 12th ranked receiver, and going from wide receiver 2 almost to wide receiver 1 from here, Allen Robinson. Yes, Allen Robinson, wide receiver of the Chicago Bears, ranked as the 9th ranked quarterback or receiver last year, had over 100 catches, 1,250 yards, 6 touchdowns. It doesn't matter if Justin Fields is quarterback. It doesn't matter if Mike Glennon, whoever was the Blake Bortles, Nick Foles. This guy's the DeAndre Hopkins of his own time. He's not as great, but he's amazing. Still only got single-digit fantasy points twice last year, and one was in Week 17, which most people don't even play in fantasy. Gotta love it. And the other one was in Week 2, so why do you need him to score fantasy points in Week 2 if you're just barely figuring it out? Great fantasy game against the Falcons, 28, 10 catches, 123 yards, and a touchdown. What about against the Saints, who have a better secondary? Still 6 catches, 87 yards, and a touchdown. What about the Packers, who have the Pro Football Focus number 1 ranked secondary? 8 catches, 74 yards, and 2 touchdowns, and 9 catches, 123 yards, and 1 touchdown against the Texans. Allen Robinson is a beast. Beast. Almost a wide receiver 1, borderline wide receiver 2, just because you don't know who the quarterback is again. And he's going to do it again and prove me wrong, but still. Let's move on to the last one, and could be almost top 10, but no. DK Metcalf. 83 catches, 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns. Ranked 7th last year in fantasy points. I don't like the inconsistency. I don't like that during the end of the playoffs. He only gave me 9. He gave me 11. Gave me 4. It's just DK Metcalf had prime matchups against the Giants, the Jets, and he only scored 13 and 18 fantasy points. Whatever Russell Wilson feels, he's going to throw it to. DK Metcalf also was one of the leading droppers in the NFL. If it's a Tyler Lockett day, they're just going to feed Tyler Lockett. If he plays the Rams, they just can't even guard the Rams. He can't even go against Jalen Ramsey. It doesn't make sense. He only dropped 4 fantasy points in Week 10 for 2 catches and 28 yards against the Rams, and 6 catches for 59 yards and 11 fantasy points. Just know, I had Deontay Johnson and Allen Robinson and had another good receiver. I forgot who the other one was. Deontay Johnson, Allen Robinson. Oh, no, I didn't have another good receiver. I just had a good another flex option because I had Antonio Gibson. So I sat down DK Metcalf in the fantasy championship because he was going against the Rams. That's a crazy move, but if you feel like he's not doing good against these certain teams, you drop him. Not drop him, but you sit him down. I started Deontay Johnson and Allen Robinson over him, and they both dropped me 20-plus fantasy points. And guess what? If I would have started DK over one of them, I would have lost. So, that's why I like to put it in tiers as opposed to rankings. I'm just telling you who I would draft over who. Allen Robinson, only reason why I don't is because Russell Wilson's a top 5 quarterback, top 3 quarterback in the NFL. And DK Metcalf was a 7th-ranked receiver last year. I just don't like the inconsistency. I'd rather you drop 15 to 20 a game than you drop 8, 9, 50, 9, 12, 9, 50, 9, 10. I want consistency. I want 20 points a game. I don't like this 50 nonsense that makes your rankings look good, like DK's 40-point fantasy game in Week 8, which doesn't matter. And it's 27 points from the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 12. So, DK Metcalf rounding out the wide receiver 2 going into wide receiver 1. When we come back, we're going to do the top 10 wide receiver 1s going into next year's fantasy draft. Julio Jones was already number 17. So, sorry, spoiler alert, but another Falcon is still on the list, which is higher than Julio, and that sounds a little disrespectful when we come back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to another segment of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you again for listening. I really appreciate it. And it's hot in the studio right now. I'm sweating. You don't need to know that image, but I'm just letting you know. I'm doing it for you guys. I make these lists, look up all the stats, do all my research, try to put all the logic together for everyone who doesn't want to do all that stuff, all that nonsense. It also helps a lot with some of my friends who I'm not in the fantasy league with, because remember, on my fantasy football don'ts, I did on my last episode, I said, do not share with people in your league your fantasy sauce, because if you do share that fantasy sauce, then, they could take it and end up taking Peyton Manning, who had one of the best NFL quarterback seasons of all time with the Denver Broncos in 2013. Should have never told my friend, but whatever. But the show also helps me tell all my other friends, hey, did you know that I'm blanking out right now, but did you know? Ooh, did you know? No, I was just telling my friend a little while ago too that, I think Justin Jefferson's really, really good. I love him going into next year. He's tops for me. He's like, how do you say that? I said, well, first of all, he had a better season than Randy Moss. Randy Moss's rookie year, and that's already a great staple in it. I'm sure you didn't know that Dalvin Cook also rushed for over 300 times, so that makes him an RB1, so it's going to have to bring safeties closer into the box and always respecting him. Kirk Cousins hasn't finished below a top 11 fantasy quarterback as long as he's been a Minnesota Viking. They also have Adam Thielen. See, all this stuff. You gotta think about it. I know I'm saying think wrong. Tink. You gotta tink. Anyways, we are back to the wide receiver one portion. The number one tier of wide receivers going into next year's fantasy draft. It's a lot of good options. It was hard to choose them, but let's do it anyway. We'll start. This guy could still be a wide receiver 2, but he's more a wide receiver 1 in my opinion. Ex-teammate of Julio Jones. Well, current teammate, but probably going to be ex. Calvin Ridley, the 5th ranked receiver going into last year. When Julio Jones isn't there, he absolutely balls. Calvin Ridley's only dropped one single-digit fantasy points one time throughout the whole year on the Carolina Panthers. Expect that might happen again, because if they figured out that sauce and they just added J.C. Horn, it's probably more likely that their defense is getting more lockdown, especially with the additions of Jeremy Chin. And I can't get the name of the linebacker. What's his name? Or safety? Brian Burns, yes. All those guys are making a young defensive core, but Calvin Ridley's a stud. First week, 34 fantasy points. Second week, 29 fantasy points. Then 16. Then he gets out a week because he doesn't play against the Packers. Second game, he's out the whole year. Next other game's in week 9, but he still drops 21, 18, 19. Then you're like, oh, how do you do in the fantasy playoffs, though? Amazing. Week 14 is where they usually start. Even if it starts week 13, let's start week 13. Saints, 5 catches, 108 yards, 15 fantasy points. What about the Chargers? A good secondary as well. 8 catches, 124 yards, 1 touchdown, 26 fantasy points. What about the Bucks, who locked down Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, and everyone in the Super Bowl and has one of the best secondaries and one of the best defenses in the NFL? 10 catches, 163 yards, 1 touchdown. Chiefs, 18 fantasy points. This guy is an absolute stud. It's almost a shame I didn't put him higher. I want to put him higher, and especially since Kyle Pitts is going to be spread out in the slot, the safety has to gravitate and put more help to that side, so that's less safety help over the top for Calvin Ridley. You can't double team both, because then they're just going to leave someone else wide open. Calvin Ridley going into next year, he could be a wide receiver 2, but I'm betting he's going to be a top 7 receiver. These other guys I love way more, and I'll tell you why. Because the next one is Keenan Allen. After that year that Justin Herbert had, Keenan Allen still had 100 catches for 992 yards and 8 touchdowns on the road to 238 fantasy points. Keenan Allen started out hot in the beginning of the year, fizzled out a little bit because Justin Herbert was learning how to play quarterback a little more. Also, the addition of Austin Eckler is going to allow Keenan Allen to get more open. Jared Cook is also a great addition. He's a good red zone threat, but they force feed Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen can almost not be guarded by anyone in the NFL. He's going against the Raiders, who, yes, they did get 6 safeties in the draft, but they addressed their cornerback or DB issues. still one of the bottom pass defense teams. Then they go against the Broncos, who have a better pass defense, but the Chiefs do not have a great pass defense. And Keenan Allen always has a feast day on the Broncos, so it doesn't matter. 992 yards. Next year, you could expect 100 catches, over 1,000 yards, and around the same from 8 to 10 touchdowns. Keenan Allen, I like better than Calvin Ridley just because he got force-fed a lot. And Justin Herbert and him are barely starting to get it clicking. Once they start to get the show rolling, it's going to be a whole completely different show. So, Keenan Allen, I wouldn't get mad if you drafted Calvin Ridley over him. I would get mad at you if you drafted Calvin Ridley over this next guy, though. Michael Thomas, well, not this next guy. I meant the guy after. Michael Thomas is my number 8 receiver. Yes, I know that he's a drama queen, and we do not want him. Speaking about drama queens, Odell Beckham is not on my list. Yes, surprisingly. Odell Beckham didn't make the top 30. None of the Browns receivers pretty much did. Yeah, he didn't have a chance at any point. I don't like anybody who's drama queen, but Michael Thomas is going to be the only option there. He is ranked 8th, but if his quarterback, he has no other receiver alongside him. It's only Traquan Smith. They didn't draft anyone, so they're probably going to milk him. The offense is literally give it to Kamara or give it to Michael Thomas. That's the offense. That's how it goes. Michael Thomas is one of the better receivers in the NFL. He had one of the best receiving performances of all time. Last year, over 1,800 yards, but this year, he only had 40 catches for 438 yards. Terrible, terrible season. Terrible time to draft him first. That's why he's second-round receiver. Going into late first round, if you're that crazy about him. I'm not. I like these other receivers a lot better than him. Michael Thomas, though, he's good. He has a lot of potential, and he's young. And you can't doubt him just because he's a drama queen. He's top 10 material. He's top 10 potential. Look for a big bounce back season unless Taysom Hill goes. If Taysom Hill goes there, Michael Thomas drops out of my top 30. I'm relying on Jameis Winston. Yes, the guy who led the league in touchdowns when he was on the Bucs in his last year with 30 touchdowns. Jameis Winston will find a way to air it out to Michael Thomas. He'll even force it to Michael Thomas and throw picks. We're okay with that. Not from a Saints fan perspective, but from just a fantasy perspective, we're okay with that. Michael Thomas going into next year, I like him a lot, but you could draft Calvin Ridley, Keenan Allen above him. It's no issue, but a piece of tissue. I don't know if that's something, but that rhymed. Yes, number 7, and someone I kind of see, like, from here on out, this is another separation of the class. I think all these guys are going to be wide receiver 1s from here on out. Everyone else I mentioned were wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1s. Even though they kind of hit the wide receiver 1 tier, they could still fall to the wide receiver 2, and I can still see it. That's why they're at the bottom. Let's move on to my other favorite pick, my number 7th pick on all my receivers. Amari Cooper, yes, I know. Decent year. He was ranked 15th in fantasy points. 232 fantasy points on 5 touchdowns, 1,100 yards, and 92 catches. But when Dak Prescott was there, he was the number 1 receiver in the league. He had 18 fantasy points, 16 fantasy points, 17 and 33. 18 against Jalen Ramsey on the Rams, by the way, too. 33 against the Cleveland Browns, by the way, too, on 12 catches. So when Dak Prescott's there, he's rocking and rolling. And this guy still managed to only give you single-digit fantasy points 3 other times with terrible quarterback play. So, Amari Cooper, Dak Prescott. Amari Cooper's the number 1 receiver out of the Dallas Cowboys. After doing all my research and seeing how Amari Cooper is when Dak is there, they're so much better. They're literally Michael Irvin and Troy Aikman. You could trust them to be a wide receiver 1 next year. As long as Dak Prescott's okay, as long as his leg's okay, Amari Cooper is an automatic wide receiver 1. Put that down right now. He's going to finish better than Michael Thomas if Dak Prescott is healthy for the whole year. The number 6 receiver on my list, and another guy who I think is a perennial number 1, A.J. Brown, who finished as the 12th receiver last year due to injuries. 70 catches, 1,075 yards, and 11 touchdowns on his way to 242 fantasy points. He missed 2 games in the beginning of the year, but he started things off hot. After that, from weeks 5 through 9, he scored over 20 fantasy points 4 out of the 5 weeks and scored a touchdown in all of those 5 weeks against the Bills, the The Steelers, he dropped 6 catches for 153 yards and a touchdown. The Bears, who have a better pass defense still, 4 catches, 101 yards, and 1 touchdown. Against the Bills, 7 catches, 82 yards, and 1 touchdown. Against the Ravens, against the Colts, 16 and 25 fantasy points. This guy is a stud, and he's going to go into the Texans twice a year, the Jaguars twice a year, and then the other teams, the Colts. But still, I told you what he did against the Colts. He got 3 fantasy points one week because he got hurt in the middle of the game. Then he was like, okay, let's run it back at Indianapolis. Okay, bet. I'll run it at your place. Let's go, bet. And guess what? 25 fantasy points. You can't hold this man if your last name was Hand. A.J. Brown is hot. He's sizzling. He's the only receiver now on that team now that they don't have Corey Davis. I expect him to be the number one option, one top 5 fantasy receiver going into next year. Him and these next other 5 guys are all going to be interchangeable. A.J. Brown is high on the Tennessee Titan list. Yes, they added Josh Reynolds, and I'm excited about him, but he's still not Corey Davis. And A.J. Brown's a man among boys. He knows how to create separation in the NFL. Like I said, he went against all these stud teams, and he still is great. And a big reason, too, is because you're looking in that backfield for the number 1 offensive player of the year, the guy who rushed for 2,000 yards in a season this past season, Derrick Henry. All hail King Henry. A.J. Brown is going to be the beneficiary of Derrick Henry being a complete animal out there. My number 5 receiver, this is where the receivers get great. This is where the receivers are great, but still all number 1. These guys are these are borderline first rounders from here on out. Everyone else, with A.J. Brown, Michael Thomas, Coop, Ridley, Keenan Allen, you get in the second round. These guys are number 1 picks, your first pick overall, and I'm going to put them in order in what I think you should draft them in. DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins is my 5th option, 4th ranked receiver last year, 115 catches on over 160 targets, 1,400 yards, and 6 touchdowns. Golly, he scored over 20 fantasy points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. This guy's a stud. Kyler Murray's going to continue to throw to him because A.J. Green will get hurt. Larry Fitzgerald's old. He knows how to get it going. DeAndre Hopkins does with terrible quarterbacks, and now he's gifted with a good quarterback and a great fantasy quarterback, a top 5 fantasy quarterback. His rushing ability makes him even more lethal. The addition of James Conner and Chase Edmonds is a decent backfield, decent enough for them to roll like the Bills offense where Josh Allen runs it and throws it a lot, and he's majority of the offense, but you hand it off occasionally to these 2 guys to help out. But DeAndre Hopkins is the Stephon Diggs of the Arizona Cardinals. I can trust DeAndre Hopkins with all arms going into next year. Last year, he was not hurt a single game. Yes, he was hurt, played hurt, but he didn't let that hurt him. And he had better games against the Rams. At least he had 7 against the Rams in a week that didn't matter. And the first week he played, which was almost people's fantasy championships or fantasy playoffs, he scored 19 fantasy points on Jalen Ramsey, 8 catches, 52 yards, a touchdown. When he goes against terrible defenses like the Giants and the Eagles, he'll give you 9 catches for 169 yards and a touchdown. So, we love it. There's also a matchup going next year. The Cardinals play the Texans. Yes, the Cardinals play the Texans. DeAndre Hopkins is going to go absolutely crazy. Mark that game down. Pencil it in. Already start DeAndre Hopkins in the beginning of the year that week because he is going to be ready to demolish the team that just wasted his whole career over there and wasted his time. DeAndre Hopkins, top 5 receiver for sure. First round receiver probably. Number 4, I have Devontae Adams. You're saying, why Devontae Adams so low? First of all, Aaron Rodgers hasn't even reported to the first day of the OTAs. So he might not be the quarterback. If he's not the quarterback, Devontae Adams is still great. He's great. But he's not better. He might not be better than DeAndre Hopkins. He might not be better than A.J. Brown or even Coop or even Calvin Ridley. He was the number 1 receiver last year, though, so I can't knock him out of the top 5 because he has route running so good. He, quote-unquote, made Chad Ochocinco cry. I don't know. Those routes must have been super crisp for him to be crying like that. So I believe the greatness and I believe the hype. 115 catches, 18 touchdowns, 1,300 yards. There's still a possibility that Aaron Rodgers could be on the team, though. So Devontae Adams went from being a 8-9 on my list to being a 4 instead of being a 1 because if Aaron Rodgers was there with open arms, Devontae Adams probably top 2. Top 2 receiver. But I would still get these other receivers that I'm going to name in front of him. You know of the greatness of Devontae Adams. I'm just going to have to defend another boy right now. And the other guy I'm going to defend at number 3, who I would draft higher than Devontae Adams and DeAndre Hopkins, but not higher than 2 other receivers that I'm going to name. Surprise, surprise, Justin Jefferson, Mr. Rookie of the Year, Offensive Rookie of the Year, 88 catches, 1,400 yards, and 7 touchdowns for 267 fantasy points, leading him to be the 6th ranked receiver in last year's fantasy football season. This year, expect a lot of the same. Pretty much 90 catches, 1,300 yards, more touchdowns, better season than Randy Moss, 1,400 yards, rookie record. After the first 2 weeks of 4-7, this guy just absolutely put on tears. 30, 14, gave you a 5, which is terrible, but still scored 39, 9, 21, 17, 26, 27 fantasy points, 9, 18, 14, 22. His first time getting acclimated to the league. From when he was already getting comfortable with the offense, from week 10 through 17, it was a go. He only scored single-digit fantasy points once, and it was 9 fantasy points. So everything else, and that was against the Bucs. The Tampa Bay Bucs, the Super Bowl defense, Tampa Bay Bucs. I like him a lot because Dalvin Cook is his rusher, so they're going to have to always keep their eyes in the backfield. He's kind of like A.J. Brown, but I think he has more potential, and he's better. He's going to play throughout the whole year, not get hurt too much. That's what he didn't. His durability, the best ability is availability, and we love Justin Jefferson going into next year. Only 2 receivers I like better than him, and you already know who number 2 is. Well, you already know who these 2 are, but number 2 would be Stephon Diggs. Stephon Diggs, absolute stud. Didn't score single-digit fantasy points in 1 game last year, and he finished as the number 2 fantasy receiver. 127 catches, 1,500 yards, 8 touchdowns. Expect a lot of the same, but expect more double team and expect them to spread the ball more. Gabriel Davis is going into his 2nd year. So instead of 1,500 yards, I expect maybe Stephon Diggs will have 1,300 yards. 100 catches still, but not as great of a year as he did this year. Still expecting double-digit fantasy points in PPR with him every week. He at least scores 6, or at least gets 6 to 10 catches a game, not including a couple games where he scored 3 touchdowns. And he doesn't rely on touchdowns too much. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 games where he didn't even score a touchdown. He still managed to produce those numbers. That shows that he's not a volatile player. He has a good consistency around him. He always gets those catches. He's going to get force-fed. Why isn't he number 1 then? He's a great receiver on the number 1 fantasy offense. Oh, no, wait. My number 1 fantasy offense is the Chiefs, and guess who's the number 1 receiver then? Tyreek Hill. I would draft Tyreek Hill. First pick, 6, first round, 6th pick, 5th pick. I don't care. Patrick Mahomes is going to be on a revenge tour. Tyreek Hill had a down year last year, still with 87 catches, 1,200 yards, 15 touchdowns. Tyreek Hill has been scoring 10 touchdowns over in a season. Ever since Patrick Mahomes has been a quarterback, he only scored single digits 1 time, and not including the Tampa Bay show, where he put 57 fantasy points, won people a week that week. He scored 15 touchdowns, which is a lot and makes him volatile, but I'm saying Patrick Mahomes always going to be the best quarterback in the league. Revenge season because they didn't do as good as last year, so it's going to give him more motivation. He's not going to slack going into this next year. Tyreek Hill's already said he wants to have a 2,000-yard season, so he has aspirations of doing it. They still have the number 1 tight end, so that's going to spread him loose. Patrick Mahomes' legs is going to spread open the offense and spread open. And Mecole Hardman taking the lid off of offenses is only going to not allow you to double team Tyreek Hill. So, I would probably say Tyreek Hill is easily the number 1. The number 1 offense, why wouldn't you have Tyreek Hill? He doesn't have as many weapons, too, as, say, the Bills do because they have Emmanuel Sanders. Say that's not Sammy Watkins, not on the team anymore. Mecole Hardman. Then they still have Gabriel Davis and Cole Beasley on that offense. And Josh Allen likes to run it more than Patrick Mahomes. He had more rushing yards than him last year. So, all that, and Patrick Mahomes likes to throw the ball a little, deeper down the field, and he's a better thrower. Not statistically last year, but he's still a better thrower overall. I like Tyreek Hill as a number 1 receiver, number 1 option, number 1 tier, wide receiver 1, write it down. Julio Jones had a lot to compete with. He used to be the number 1 guy. He helped me win a championship 1 year in 2015, but those years are gone, and now we are moving forward. Let me know what you think at GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast on Twitter. When we come back, I'm going to give you a preview of the Seahawks and the Los Angeles Rams after this commercial break.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
And we are back here at the end of the show at the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Thank you again for listening to my 3 tiers of wide receivers going into next year's fantasy draft. We went backwards all the way from the bottom tier to the top tier. Julio Jones finished at like the 17th. He finished as a wide receiver 2/wide receiver 3. We don't know where he's going to next year. It could be the Patriots, Ravens, Chargers. Who knows? Whoever wants him. Titans want him real bad. DeAndre Hopkins said he would take a pay cut to get him, so it's really just up in the air. I have no idea where he's going to go, but he already stated that he's up out of there on Undisputed today with Skip and Shannon on the Fox Sports Network. Right now, we are going to go into a preview. Also, let me know if you think Tyreek Hill shouldn't be number 1, Stephon Diggs. Let me know at GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. If you think someone's better, like Mike Evans, or I don't know, think A.J. Brown, DeAndre Hopkins. If you think Justin Jefferson's too high, Stephon Diggs is the real number 1 in your heart, then let me know. Let me know I'm wrong. But we went over all that, all the receivers. You are here at the end of the show because we are going to give 2 fantasy team previews. We'll start off first with the Seattle Seahawks. Seattle Seahawks, who had the 17th most yards per game last year, on their way to finish as the number 1 team in the NFC West. But they only threw for the 16th most passing yards with 3,941. They were 12th in rushing yards on their way to a 12-4 record. The Seahawks started out the season hot, but they went away from their normal game planning. DK Metcalf said towards the end of the year that in an interview, he said they're kind of starting to figure us out. I think it was the Matt Barnes interview and Brandon Marshall and all those other guys. Chad Johnson, Brandon Marshall, the wide receiver crew that they have. They were saying, hey, I think people figured out we're going to run, and then throw deep. Play action, pass deep. Run, play action, pass deep. Really basic, but they still scored a lot of points. Like I said, 6 in total points. But they went away from that running MO that they have. 60% pass, 40% run for that offense last year. They're predicted to win about 9.5 games, so over 9 games next year. Let's start with the number 1 guy there. Numero uno, Russell Wilson. Through the first 8 weeks of the season, like I said, Russell Wilson was hot. He was cooking as a QB1 with a whopping 26 touchdowns and only 6 interceptions. However, in his final 8 games, I guess you could say it lacked some of that flavor, some of that goodness that you thought Russ was cooking in the beginning, and it just ended up tasting terrible. The dessert was awful. Last games were terrible, and he threw for 12 fewer touchdowns in the second half of the NFL season, which was only 14. Over that time frame, he was only a QB 11. Looking to 2021, Seattle has a new offensive coordinator, Shane Waldron, who coached under Sean McVay, if he can incorporate some of the same type of play calling we saw from the Rams and use more effective play action. Like I said, everyone is figuring out the basic form of their play action. So, since they're figuring it out, it's not really hard. You're going to stack the box, and then when you know, oh, it's play action, they just have the safety be the deepest man, and there's no way they're going to outthrow two guys beating DK most of the time. Still, DK and Tyler Lockett are special weapons, but this could help Russ be more consistent down the stretch, and have him more as a mid-range, very safe, like high upside QB1. Russell Wilson, apparently today, there's rumors saying that Russell Wilson is actually not going to extend his new contract with the Seattle Seahawks. Mind you, his contract does not run up until he's 36. But if the Seattle Seahawks don't do anything different, which I don't know what more Russell Wilson wants. He was crying because the defense was taking too much love, and they were saying, oh, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't for me. Now he's the man of the show. He showed everyone what he could do in the first 8 weeks. And then he played the Rams 2 times in the last 8 weeks, and it didn't work out for him, I guess. But not only that, Russell Wilson got knocked out by John Wolfman and Jared Goff in the playoffs. Russell Wilson was the key to his own destiny. He had the keys to his own Lamborghini destiny that he thinks that the Seattle Seahawks are, even though they had one of the worst defenses in all of NFL. Yes, they have great weapons, but their running game can't stay consistent without a consistent running back. That leads us to their running back. Oh, by the way, Russell Wilson was 7th in fantasy points per game with 22. Had the second highest touchdown rate out of quarterbacks in the NFL with 7.2%. But Chris Carson, the 14th ranked running back in fantasy last year, averaging 15 points per game in fantasy. He had a rough sledding last year, especially saying they're a run-heavy, more offense, because he wasn't dependent on touchdowns, so he didn't get much touchdowns, so he didn't score much touchdowns. So because of all that, he scored a lot less fantasy points. With more creative play calling with this new offensive coordinator, we could see holes open up a bit more for Seattle's run game, which could be similar to the Rams' run game, which was an effective run game last year and the year when Todd Gurley was finally going off. That's what helped them go to the Super Bowl, propelled them up there. Chris Carson has the potential to be running back 2, running back 3. You get him in the 5th, 6th round. He did get hurt a lot last year. That prevented him playing and helping me in fantasy championships, so that's why I had to trade him. Trade him and Chris Godwin. I called it the trade of the Chris's. It's the best thing that could have happened to me. Yes, I traded both of them. Chris Carson, I wouldn't advise really drafting unless you could get him in the 6th round. Hopefully the Rams coordinator can help open up that play calling, but that's all we're going off of, so who knows. But that running game, that passing game, those receivers, Russ at quarterback, the way he could stretch plays, that helps Chris Carson's ability a lot because you have to worry about so many things on the Seattle offense. Chris Carson's almost the last thing on your mind. But they're looking to give it to Rashad Penny and have Carlos Hyde or someone help out in that backfield. So Chris Carson, you would have him as a running back 15 through 20, even though they say they're a quote-unquote heavy run offense. I don't like the turmoil with Russell Wilson. DK broke out in 2020 with 83 catches for over 1,300 yards and 10 touchdowns. Like I said, finished the year as a wide receiver 7. There's no reason to expect anything less from that. He's going to be anything from a wide receiver 7 to 11 or 10. Like I said, wide receiver 1/wide receiver 2. He finished 14th in targets per game out of receivers with 8.1. You like the targets. You don't like that he's going to get great games sometimes and then great games none. You didn't like that, because Jalen Ramsey's in our fantasy championship or fantasy playoffs, now DK Metcalf's going to get locked up and I have to sit him down. Even though I traded Stephon Diggs for him. I traded Stephon Diggs for DK Metcalf, and what did I get? A guy who's going to drop me 11 in the fantasy championship? No. And that's not even his fault. Sometimes it's because they give 53 fantasy points to Tyler Lockett, takes away from DK Metcalf. Speaking about Tyler Lockett, that's been the case for Tyler Lockett in the past couple of years. It's been full of ups and downs. He's finished right behind DK Metcalf as wide receiver 8. And like I said, his jaw-dropping 53-point Week 17 performance, but that made 20% of his production. Like the rest of the Seattle offense, he faded down the stretch. However, the gap between Lockett and DK Metcalf is bigger to me than people think. DK Metcalf is slowly taking over that offense. Like I said, he broke out last year in his second year, 1,300 yards, 10 touchdowns. Tyler Lockett's going to take some big games away from him, but he's not someone you could trust down the stretch of seasons. He always fades as the season progresses. The days of Tyler Lockett always getting 20 fantasy points are over. DK Metcalf is the number one guy there. I know he drops the ball a lot, but Russell Wilson is going to want to win games, so he's just going to spread the ball and the offense. And this is another guy who's going to take plays away from Tyler Lockett, so they can't be throwing those deep balls all the time that everyone's already ready for. Gerald Everett, the Rams took him in the second round of the 2017 draft, but they haven't done anything with him. And now it's his time. It's a one-year deal, so he's going to prove it. It's a one-year prove-it deal. It's those deals where it's like, all right, show us what you got. And he could turn into a tight end one going on for the rest of the season. He's someone I'm looking to stash at the end of drafts. Gerald Everett was decent, but they did run a 2 tight end system on the Rams along with a bunch of receivers. Russell Wilson has not had a good enough tight end like Gerald Everett in his career. He had Greg Olsen, who was good, but he's fading towards the end of his career, and he retired recently. Will Dissly, who was good, but not as athletic. And who's the other one that's good? Jacob Holster, not as athletic. This guy's a pure catching tight end. He's going to be out here for fantasy purposes only. I expect him to get things from 8 to 14 fantasy points a game. Gerald Everett will. On this offense, it's a run-heavy offense, so you're going to be worried about the run. So with the new offensive coordinator, and an offensive coordinator who is on the Rams, so he knows how the Seattle Seahawks, how Gerald Everett likes to operate. He'll be able to cater towards him. Expect that Gerald Everett and Russell Wilson love to happen a lot more frequently. Speaking about the Rams, let's move on to them as I finish up my Seattle Seahawks team preview. Let's move on to the Rams, who are projected to win more games last year as they finished second in the NFC West last year. The Rams scored the 22nd most points in 2020 while throwing for the 13th most passing yards, and they were 10th in total rushing yards on their way to a 10-6 record. Yes, they finished second in the NFC West. They threw for 4,000 passing yards in total, 13th in the NFL. Like I said, 2,018 rushing yards, which was the better part of the Rams offense. The Rams had Jared Goff, though, and he was poo-poo. And we don't want poo-poo on our fantasy championship teams. So now they have Matt Stafford, a more capable quarterback, a 4,000-yard passer. And offensive-minded Sean McVay is not okay with his team being 22nd in points scored, and that he knew he had to improve at the quarterback. So he took out Jared Goff. The rumor was that he was over Jared Goff after they played the Seattle Seahawks against C.J. Beathard, and they lost. Once he realized, I can't beat C.J. Beathard and my rival, then they realized they have to move on at quarterback. So I know Sean McVay is going to be more excited with Matt Stafford. Matt Stafford, you think he's old, but he's just 2 years away from his top 5 fantasy season, averaging 21 points per game before injuries shortened it to 8 games. Now pair him with a Sean McVay and a top 10 supporting cast with Cam Akers, Robert Woods, Cooper Kupp, all these other guys on their team, Tyler Higbee. I have him as a back-end QB1 going into next year. You could trust him in the later rounds, and maybe someone who could be a top 10 value in the later rounds. But the best guy on this offense is definitely Cam Akers. Only finished 52nd among running backs with 7.8 fantasy points per game. But we know what he did in the later end of the season. And in 2 playoff games, he racked up 221 yards and a whopping 46 attempts and scored 2 touchdowns. With Malcolm Brown completely off the team now, I think he's on the Seahawks now, we should expect Akers to get close to around 20 touches per game, which is all you need to and want for an RB20, especially for a team that runs it 44% of the time. They almost run it half of the time. Rams didn't know they had an RB1, so they weren't running it a lot. But you can expect them to run it more, especially after seeing the potential of Cam Akers. He broke Eric Dickerson's rookie rushing record against the Patriots, who are not a tough, easy defense to go against. And he has great receivers alongside of him that's going to open up the field. Let's talk about those receivers. Let's talk about Robert Woods, who finished 19th in points per game with 15 points per game, and Cooper Kupp, who finished 30th with 13 points per game. With Woods, Cooper Kupp, and Deshaun Jackson, it's going to be a fun receiving core. Woods is the bet to lead the team in receptions, but I don't think Kupp will be too far behind. I like Woods as a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, like I told you earlier before on the show. Kupp went from being a wide receiver 4 in 2019 to a wide receiver 26 in 2020, and he only caught 2 fewer passes, which is crazy. Well, that happens when you only score 3 touchdowns. Expect that number to go up in 2021. I have him as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. He barely was on the outside of my top 3 wide receiver tiers earlier in the show. And Deshaun Jackson has only played in 8 games in the past 2 seasons due to injury. At 34, he's viewed as a better real football option more than a fantasy option, and he could be left on the waiver wire. Even if he were to drop 14 in one game, I wouldn't advise getting him because the next week he might get hurt or might even drop you 0. He's the ultimate prime definition of boomer bust. Give you 2 week, 1 week, 20 the next week. All depends what Matt Stafford cooks up with Deshaun Jackson. That wide receiving core is great, but Robert Woods, I had him at 21 on my list. I like him there. I like him. You could draft him around the Adam Thielen range. If Adam Thielen's still on the board and Brandon Ayuk and Deontay Johnson, all these guys are still on the board, you could get Robert Woods. Robert Woods' consistency, we like it. Cooper Kupp was not consistent last year, and we don't like it. But Matt Stafford's a completely new quarterback, so we are going to see Jared Goff wasn't a good quarterback last year. Let's not forget. And 2 years ago, let's talk about the guy who was going off 2 years ago, Tyler Higbee. He was a tight end 8, but he fell to a tight end 17 in 2020. You expect him to jump back into the top 10, or at least right outside of the top 10 in 2021, because guess who's not there? Gerald Everett, who I just mentioned, is on the Seattle Seahawks. The poor Rams offense couldn't get anything going. Sean McVay was just extremely frustrated last year, especially with the play of the Los Angeles Rams. They were the 12th worst team in a turnover ratio. They were -3 in turnovers. So they gave up 3 more turnovers than they gotten or received. And that says a lot, because that defense has definitely scored a lot of turnovers. The Rams are going to look to pick that back up going into next year. It's all on the passing game, and it's all up to Matt Stafford. Matt Stafford's they're gonna live and die by Matt Stafford. Let's hope Matt Stafford does not get injured going into next year. Knock on wood. But it's tough. It's tough because Matty Ice. Well, he's not Matty Ice. Matt Ryan is, but Matt Stafford has been plagued by the Lions, so we haven't been able to see, I guess, the true form of Matt Stafford. He's getting older. He's almost hitting his 30s. Is Matt Stafford still good, or is he washed goods? Who knows? I don't know. But I think my bet is next year is the Rams are going to be one of the better teams. They have one of the better defenses. Could be a top 10 offense, potentially. Could be a top 10 offense. Cam Akers is an absolute monster. He's a wide running back 2 on my list. Could even be a running back 1. He's on the border. When a running back is starting to see where he wants to go, then I'll make my top 3 tiers of running backs. But as of now, it was my top 3 tiers of wide receivers going into next year's fantasy draft. Julio Jones finished at 17. Sorry, Julio, but you're not the same guy at 32. Number 1 was Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, and Justin Jefferson was 3. I love these teams. I love giving fantasy advice to you guys. Thank you again for listening. Those were my NFL team previews on the Rams and the Seattle Seahawks. Make sure you go back and listen to the show. If you missed any of the receivers, maybe there's a receiver I didn't say and you want to just badger me on Twitter, let me know. I want to hear. I like being accountable of the research I do, as opposed to you just being passive and going like, yeah, that's what it is. No, hold me accountable. Let me know what I'm saying wrong, what I'm not getting right, what doesn't make sense. Thank you again for listening to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We appreciate you. We love you. Have a good night. And I'll be back next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.